On the evening of July 15, 1976, at the police station in Austin, Texas, USA, a series of missing person calls were recorded. The common point of the reported missing victims were all elementary school students from Oakwood Elementary, and all were present on the school bus taking the children home after attending a swimming class at summer camp. This bus was driven by a driver named Frank Edwards. Strangely, after a search, the killer driver and 26 children seemed to have evaporated from this world, as if a demonic hand had taken the bus and all the people on it and hidden them in another world. To find out what happened, please continue watching this video. On the afternoon of July 15, 1976, as usual, parents stood at the bus stops on time to pick up their children returning from summer camp. But oddly, after 30 minutes, there was still no sign of the yellow school bus that usually carried Oakwood Elementary students. An hour after contacting the school, they confirmed the bus had left the summer camp on time. Parents began to feel that something was wrong. They stood restlessly, and after some thought, decided to report to the police. The parents' instincts told them that something terribly wrong might have happened to that bus. So where exactly did the bus carrying 26 elementary school students, including 7 girls and 19 boys, along with the driver named Frank, go? Everything perhaps had to go back to the time before the parents realized their children had not been brought home. It was around 3:30 p.m. on July 15, 1976, amid the sweltering summer heat of Texas, USA. The school bus carrying 26 Oakwood Elementary students rolled along the familiar road from the lake back home. On the bus, the children were laughing and joking happily with the driver. However, soon after, Frank suddenly noticed a small white van blocking the road ahead. The van looked a bit old, with long scratches along its body like claw marks. For a moment, Frank thought someone's car might have broken down, so he drove slowly, a bit hesitant whether to stop or not. Finally, he decided to stop and check the situation, not realizing that this action would make him truly regret it. Frank had just opened the door and taken a few steps when suddenly, from inside the van, 3 men in black masks holding shotguns rushed towards Frank. One of them pointed a gun at him, while the other 2 physically restrained him, twisting his arms behind his back and forcing him to lead them onto the bus. All 3 looked like Americans, with one seeming taller than the other 2. He appeared to be the leader. They got on the bus, threatening and forcing the children to hand over all their electronic devices. They then compelled Frank to drive according to their directions, heading towards Highway 21. One of them drove the white van, following closely behind and pressing against the school bus. Among the 26 children on the bus, the oldest was only 14 years old, while the youngest was a little girl named Emily, just 5 years old. She was too young to comprehend that she was in an extremely dangerous situation. The journey continued longer than usual. At first, the children were still teasing each other because they didn't know that in a few hours, they would become victims of deranged, insane minds. As time passed, the children gradually began to feel scared facing the 2 bad guys with expressionless faces and guns in their hands. The children slowly realized this was not a joke. Every minute, every second on the digital clock on the bus passed by extremely heavily. At 4:15 p.m., the attackers ordered Frank to stop the bus in front of a dark, deep drainage tunnel that emitted a strong stench of waste mixed with decomposing animal carcasses. The masked men forced Frank and the children onto 2 other vehicles that were already parked there. These 2 vehicles had their windows completely covered with black tape, and the outside was tightly clad with wooden planks, looking like an impenetrable bunker from the inside. When the vehicle doors slammed shut, the space inside became pitch black. Frank was now extremely panicked. He didn't know if they simply wanted to kidnap them or turn him and all the children into victims for some sick entertainment. Anyway, the vehicle carrying 27 people hurriedly rolled away. Frank and the 26 children were in a cramped and very stuffy truck bed. This truck bed was like a moving coffin. No light, no sound from outside. Inside, there was only a ventilation tube to prevent those sitting inside from suffocating. Some children started crying softly. Some vomited all over the truck due to motion sickness and fear. The truck reeked of vomit and waste. Frank could no longer determine the time and direction. The older children comforted the little ones. Some kept their eyes glued to the pitch-black window, trying to catch a glimpse of the scenery outside. After about 11 hours, the vehicle stopped. Actually, the two trucks carrying the children and Frank had left the Colorado River area, which is a river in central Texas, USA, and arrived in Houston, a city in Harris County, Texas, USA, about 100 miles northwest of Austin. Although the winding detour made Frank and the children completely unaware of where they were. Finally, when the vehicle stopped, the sound of metal locks clanging rang out. The door swung open, and the masked men used their gun butts to bang on the side of the truck, ordering those inside to get out. In the dim light, Frank saw that they were on a desolate, barren land full of rocks and gravel. Here, they forced Frank to clearly state his name, date of birth, home address, and leave behind his shoes and clothes. Then they led him to a passage down into a deep, dark pit. Frank hesitated, and they jabbed their elbows hard into his ribs, forcing him to go down immediately. With trembling steps, Frank descended the wooden ladder leading him down the pit. It was an entrance about 3.7 meters deep. Inside the pit, under the dim light of a lamp hanging on the wall, Frank realized it was a cabin of a truck. There were some old mattresses, flashlights, some water, bread. In the back, there was also a makeshift toilet. On all four sides of the cabin, there were long claw-like scratch marks. There were also faded brown stains that looked like dried blood. It really made one shudder. In the cabin was a ventilation fan to maintain a bit of air for them to breathe. But if the ground collapsed or if something blocked the ventilation pipe, they would very quickly suffocate. At this point, the driver understood that the oxygen supply was limited, and if he and the children didn't get out of the vehicle soon, the likelihood of death was very high. One by one, the children were brought down into the cabin. They also had to leave their personal belongings outside. One little girl even had a lock of her hair cut off. When all the children had been forced into the pit, the criminals cast cold glares down into this pit, then slammed the pit door shut. Immediately after, Frank and the children all heard a sound like someone was shoveling dirt onto the pit cover. Now the pit only had the humming sound of the ventilation fan. Other than that, all four sides were tightly packed earth. It was clear that Frank and the children had been buried alive. While most of the children were extremely scared and panicked, suddenly Michael, a 14-year-old boy, began to calm everyone down. He sang and told stories to comfort the children. At this moment, Frank truly admired the boy because in this situation, even an adult like him was trembling with fear, yet a boy who was only 14 years old could be a pillar of support for everyone. Time passed heavily. The children had all fallen asleep from exhaustion. Imagine if one day we opened our eyes and found ourselves lying in a cramped coffin buried deep underground. And no matter how loudly we cried or screamed, no matter how hard we scratched at the coffin lid until our nails bled, we couldn't escape that tight space, and then we would slowly die in there without anyone knowing. How terrifying would that be? When silence returned, Michael told Frank about his intention to find a way to escape. The boy and Frank began to try to remember if there was any favorable position before going down into the pit, where they could dig and get to the surface. After some thought, both Michael and Frank remembered a makeshift toilet. They could dig an escape route through that hole, but in reality it was just a shallow hole with the bottom sealed by dirt. Then they came up with a way to use the mattresses to stack up high enough to reach the entrance on the pit ceiling. From there they could dig a way to crawl up to the ground. They moved very quietly for fear that if the criminals hadn't left, they would hear the noise and could kill them in an instant. They propped a piece of wood found in the truck between the truck cover and the cabin, then used all their strength to slide it to one side until it opened up enough space for a person to crawl out. In this life and death moment, Frank was truly moved by the image of Michael, the brave boy full of determination, as he continuously dug at the earth with his hands until exhaustion. But even then, Michael only rested for a moment before continuing. Perhaps when people are pushed to the brink, even a child will burst out with a powerful survival instinct. After many efforts, when it felt like they had dug close to the surface but hit a wooden box blocking the way, the children and Frank decided to dig a path around that wooden box. They took turns digging, and after 16 hours of being buried alive, at 8 p.m. on July 16, 1976, the first ray of light entered their sight. At this moment, Frank and the 26 children burst into happiness. Then Michael once again proved to be a brave boy. Michael volunteered to go out first to see if the bad guys were still outside. When he poked his head out, the boy breathed a sigh of relief because there was no one around, just an empty field. Then he signaled for the other children to escape one by one. The last person to escape was Frank. They lay on the ground, feeling the air of freedom. Their next task was to quickly find a direction to escape. Suddenly, Frank heard the sound of an excavator operating. He led the children to run in the direction of that sound. The night shift workers at the quarry suddenly saw a group of people with a miserable, mud-covered appearance emerge in the night. All the workers stood stunned for a moment. Only when they came to their senses and heard all the explanations from Frank did they believe and rush out to bring Frank and the children to the rest tent, while calling the police and ambulance. The police quickly arrived and took all the children and Frank to safety at the police station. Hearing the accounts of the hostages, they quickly narrowed down the area and arrested the suspects. The three suspects were Frederick Green, son of the quarry owner, and his two friends, the brothers James and Richard Spencer. Of the three, only Richard Spencer turned himself in immediately after learning that the police were investigating him. His brother was arrested in Palo Alto, California, near the quarry. Meanwhile, Frederick Green was arrested while hiding in Vancouver, Canada. The investigation results revealed a motive that shocked the public. Specifically, they had kidnapped and nearly buried alive 27 people to demand a $5 million ransom. But ironically, the three perpetrators were originally from wealthy families, especially Frederick Green. In fact, because their families were wealthy, they indulged in debauchery and gambling, leading to a large debt. But wanting to prove to their parents that they could still make money on their own without relying on their parents, they came up with the plan to kidnap all the students and the driver on the school bus that day. They had spent time studying the daily route of that bus, so the plan was meticulously and very elaborately constructed. They even felt excited when planning, as if they were playing roles in blockbuster movies. After the investigation and prosecution process, all three criminals were sentenced to life imprisonment. The Spencer brothers, James and Richard, were pardoned in 2014 and 2015 respectively. Frederick Green was denied pardon because he did not recognize the seriousness of the crime he had committed. More than 40 years after the incident ended, the 26 victims still suffer severe consequences. Since the incident occurred, they have been almost unable to return to normal life as before. Michael, the brave boy at that time, became a severe alcoholic, physically weak, and almost limited contact with strangers. Jennifer H. suffered from sleep phobia, prolonged insomnia, fear of confined spaces to the extent that she couldn't use elevators. Also, one of the children at that time, Larry Park, often showed signs of irritability towards young children, couldn't control his emotions, or self-harmed. He even used drugs to cope with his psychological illness. We can see that, even though the victims had escaped from that dark pit that year, the crisis was so great that it was enough to cause them many difficulties due to the psychological trauma of being buried alive in the dark, cold underground.